CMS, AAMI, JC, DNV, CDC, WHO. What are they and which one do I follow? Hey Sterile Processing Professionals, Brandon the Sterile Guy here. In today's video, I want to break down all the acronyms that you come across in your department and not only what they are, but which ones you need to follow. Now, a couple things to know about these acronyms. They all serve different purposes in the field, but some of them kind of serve the same purpose and you have to figure out which one is the right one to follow. I'm gonna quickly break these down and start with the most important up front and work my way down the line. So if you wanna understand all these acronyms, you gotta watch the full video. Right up front, let's talk about CMS, Joint Commission, and DNV. A lot of people think that Joint Commission is the top dog when it comes to your hospital with inspections and standards. But did you know that they're just an accrediting agency and they're not the top dog? They all follow the rules and regulations from CMS, which is called the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services. CMS combines the oversight of the Medicare program, the federal portion of the Medicaid program, the state children's health insurance program, and the health insurance marketplace, as well as other quality assurance activities. So, since CMS works both with the insurance side and the rulemaking side, well, I have my own opinions about that. Money corrupts everything, and that includes patient care. Those two things should not live under the same roof, but I didn't make the rules and laws. Now, CMS isn't even the top dog because they fall under the Department of Health and Human Services. Now, DHS is an executive branch of the government, and if you're familiar with your government and politics, you know the executive branch reports up to the president. Now, the other acronym you may have heard, or maybe you've heard me say it, is DNV, which stands for Det Norsk Veritas. And this is just another Joint Commission accrediting agency. Interestingly enough, DNV is actually headquartered in Norway, which is kind of weird, but again, I don't make the rules. So CMS sets all the rules and regulations down to every single department in your healthcare system, to even include rules down to specific infection prevention rules. Joint Commission and DNV take these rules and regulations and actually inspect your hospital against these rules, and they have the authority to discipline you and even shut your hospital down if you're not meeting standards. CMS also does assessments, and sometimes you'll see them with DNV or Joint Commission. They usually do like every 3 years. They'll come and inspect themselves, but also be inspecting the Joint Commission or DNV surveyors as well. To give you a visual, here is the hierarchy of these agencies. Okay, CMS, DNV, and Joint Commission out of the way. Let's move on. Now let's talk about the FDA, OSHA, EPA, AAMI, WHO, and the CDC. You might be curious why I'm including AAMI in this portion, but I'll get to that in just a minute. Each of these entities serves a different purpose, but they all have rules and areas that affect your processes in your department. But depending on what it is, the verbiage or language that maybe the FDA is using might not be coming from the FDA. It might be coming from a higher authority that the FDA is using those rules and implementing them as well. So for instance, the CDC, it's in charge of disease control. They track diseases, organism mutations, prevalence of diseases, epidemics, pandemics, you name it. However, if you've ever read through the CDC website, you might have seen that they have an area that they talk about sterilization and disinfection processes. But if you actually read through, you'll see that they're not very detailed. They're almost a little bit generic. And that's because they're adopting their standards from another entity. Can you guess what that entity is? You're right, that's AAMI. AAMI is the top dog for sterilization and disinfection processes. AAMI stands for the Association for the Advancement of Medical Instrumentation. AAMI is a nonprofit, it's non-governmental, it's politically neutral, and it's all about setting the standards with evidence-based practices for sterilization and disinfection. This sounds super great, but if you've ever read in the AAMI book, the list of all the board members and chair people, you'll notice there is a lot of people from vendors like Halyard and Case Med and One Tray. They're all on this board writing the rules for sterilization and disinfection. So I'm torn on this one because yes, there's vendors on there, but there's also specialists and professionals and scientists on there as well. But money talks. So of course, any vendor is going to vote on changes that benefit them regardless of evidence or anything else that is presented, because it always comes down to the money. And if you work for a company, say for instance, One Tray, you're always gonna vote for something that pushes more towards trays as opposed to wrap, regardless of the evidence. But another reason I'm torn is because of the process for vendors to get their products approved through the FDA. They have to go through a lot of third-party research, and they do a lot of their own research so that they can update their information with the FDA, so they can state whether something can be sterile longer, whether it can last longer, its durability. So they bring a lot of scientific evidence to AAMI. But in the end, I think they should collaborate with AAMI, but I don't think they should have a voting role when it comes to the standard changes. Their feet are in the money. Just like our political representatives, money sways votes. Little off topic, but CDC is for disease control. So what about WHO? WHO, the World Health Organization. I originally thought when I heard WHO, oh gosh, this is the top dog over CDC, because CDC is just America. WHO is the world. They have to be the one who's setting the standards. But surprise, CDC does not report to WHO. WHO is an intergovernmental organization that is actually based in Geneva, Switzerland. The CDC and the WHO are partners. They do work together and share information, but at the same time, they will have differences when it comes to certain information. This showed up during the whole COVID pandemic when WHO was putting out some standards and CDC's were different. It can be very political. It can be very dependent on the research that they're getting from different entities. So just so you know, one does not report to the other. Now let's talk about the FDA, the organization that covers any medical device and medications. Now, contrary to popular belief, the FDA does not set the standards on how devices are used, but they do have a very strong application process for vendors to sell and market their medical devices using the process called 510K. Vendors undergo a complicated submission application process, submitting their evidence and information to get their technology or medical devices verified by the FDA. The FDA requires instructions for use. However, the FDA does not set a standard of what the instructions for use must look like. And this is why you can look through IFUs and they could be vastly different. They only require a minimum amount of information that must be in there, and then it's up to the vendor to kind of fill in whatever they deem necessary. Now, OSHA is the Occupational Safety and Health Organization. OSHA is all about workplace safety. They can dabble in design, chemical use, ergonomics, PPE, basically anything that can help to prevent harm to employees or address anything that could harm employees. But they do govern the safety precautions like training, expectations, provided safety equipment, hazard signage, and more stuff like that. If your department has leaky washer disinfectors that cause people to slip and injure themselves, that's an OSHA area. OSHA can investigate these injuries, and they can also apply penalties if they find that you are negligent or not following the rules or not taking reasonable effort to fix the problems. During the pandemic, for instance, OSHA was fining a lot of restaurants that refused to close down when they were supposed to and stay open because OSHA was claiming that they were putting their workers at risk. Now, this is highly political. I'm not saying one side or the other is correct. I'm just describing what OSHA is capable of. Okay, last one in this section, the EPA. This is the Environmental Protection Agency. This agency covers everything that can be harmful or damaging to our environment. This includes gases, chemicals, aerosols, anything like that that could be damaging. If you have an ETO sterilizer in your department, you probably have annual or semi-annual inspections by the EPA. ETO is a very toxic gas, and the EPA has strong regulations around this and inspects regularly and will fine you heavily if you're not following the protocols. So here is another visual of how these agencies interact with each other and with the hospital. As you can see, they're all equal. But here's the difference. When it comes to sterilization and disinfection processes, it's much different. A.m.E. is the top dog, which the WHO, the World Health Organization, the CDC, and the FDA all get their information from and passes down through them. But A.m.E. also is a direct to the hospital as well. The FDA, the WHO, and the CDC just choose to adopt some of their standards. The EPA and the OSHA really have nothing to do with medical devices, so they're not really anywhere in that authority scheme. Okay, last set of acronyms, I promise. Let's get into A.m.E., AORN, Cigna, and manufacturer IFUs. As we spoke about earlier, A.m.E. sets the standards for everything sterilization and disinfection. They basically set at least 90% of the rules and process designations that you use within your sterile processing department. Now, AORN is the Association of Operating Room Nurses. You'll often hear a lot of information coming out of AORN when it comes to sterilization and disinfection processes. They even have like regular publications, and I think even a magazine, and AORN sends out a lot of that information to nurses. Now, just like the CDC and WHO, AORN pulls all their sterilization and disinfection information from A.m.E., and they just regurgitate it. And this is kind of necessary because our jobs overlap. Nursing, surgical techs, sterile techs, we all overlap with medical instrumentation. Their primary purpose is to set evidence-based standards for nursing. Now, you might be a little bit frustrated that sterilization and disinfection processes are being funneled through AORN, but here's the good thing. If they're funneled through AORN, and we already know that A.m.E. says that surgical techs must be pre-cleaning the instruments and stuff, then that only further helps us with our evidence of why they should be doing their job. Okay, Cigna, SGNA. This stands for the Society of Gastroenterology Nurses and Associates. SGNA sets the standard for everything endoscopy. They don't set the standards for how endoscopes are made, but they do set the standards for how those endoscopes are used, cleaned, and stored. Now, A.m.E., AORN, and even your certification agencies, CBSPD and HSPA, all get their endoscope information from Cigna. Okay, so here we are to the final acronym, which is IFU, and this stands for Instructions for Use. Now, you would think that IFUs, because they're talking about medical instrumentation, would be covered under A.m.E., and they kind of are, but also they're not. Now, let me explain. FDAs are actually covered by the FDA, which we talked about earlier, part of the application process for the 510K. Where A.m.E. comes in is they make it absolute requirement that you must follow the IFUs from the manufacturer that was approved through the FDA. If you read A.m.E., you'll hear a lot of referencing about manufacturer IFUs. They want you to stick to the validated, evidenced process that they know works. Now, here's another visual which explains the acronyms we just talked about: A.m.E., AORN, Cigna, and IFUs. When it comes to sterilization and disinfection processes, everything funnels down from A.m.E. And lastly, here's a couple visuals of how all the acronyms interact. The first visual shows everything except the regulatory agencies as far as authority on sterilization and disinfection processes. As you can see, everything flows down from A.m.E., and OSHA and EPA really have nothing to do with medical instrumentation. On this last visual, I've included the CMS, the Joint Commission, and the DNV. And as you can see, of all these agencies, when it comes to sterilization and disinfection, A.m.E. is the top dog, period. So when you hear someone say, "What does A.m.E. say about that?" That is the key question, because A.m.E. is always correct when it comes to sterilization and disinfection. If you hung on this long, thank you so much for watching. Any topics or videos you want to see, put it in the comments down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I love you guys, and I'll catch you in the next video.